So this is what we're making. A turquoise ring with a Chenier piece of tubing for a fancy stone embedded in the turquoise. This is a 2mm hollow core diamond drill bit. Now, oftentimes your diamond bits are the same diameter the whole length, which means that you can't use your quick handle, but you can use a number 30 handpiece or a Dremel as long as it has a Jacob's chuck. So just snug, make sure it's centered. And we need water, because when you're using a diamond drill bit, you have to keep it lubricated, and water is one of the easiest ways to do it. So we'll just snap our number 30 handpiece on here. And what I'm going to do is, your stone constantly wet, what I'm going to do is go ahead and put it under the water, completely under the water. That way I don't have to keep dipping it in and out. So drill a little, take the drill out, drill a little, take it out. That way it gives the water a chance to go in and clean out the muck. And you can see that it's starting to give a decent cutting. So we'll just go ahead and go all the way through. So this is what we want, a nice clean hole, and the piece that would normally go up in here may break off, but it doesn't really matter because this is hollow all the way through. So you can see by that last bit that I went ahead and went all the way through. And that's what we want. So now I'm going to take my Chenier, put it through, make sure that it doesn't go all the way through, because we want it short enough that when we put our stone in, we want to make sure it's flush. So cut it slightly shorter than the stone. And I'm just marking it with my thumbnail. Put a mark on it. And I use the Chenier cutter. Well, they call it a cutter, but it's actually a holder. And this is a Bergian, which is a good one. And it's good because the slot for the blade is small enough that it makes a straight cut. And I put it over my limel tray before I tried to take the piece out, because normally if you just lift your blade up, it throws your piece somewhere where it's difficult to find. So now I have my Chenier the correct length. What I'll do is take it out and go ahead and make my bezel and set the stone. So I'll go ahead and do the whole thing, and then I'll hand this over to Pete and let him do the stone setting in the Chenier and glue it into place. So this is the Chenier, and I flared it a little just by putting a punch in and tapping it. And that way it made it big enough that it wouldn't drop through the hole. And it's basically started the angle for the setting of the stone. So we'll just set this aside until the setting is finished. So I have my strip of bezel wire. You call it just 0.5 thick fine silver. And it's fairly high for the type stone, but you can see that the edge of the stone is rough. So I actually have to bring this up that far to cover all the imperfections. So it'll just be a regular bezel setting. So we just wrap the bezel around the stone, mark it, and I always use a permanent marker. And I use the shears. Try to get it as close as possible. Check, and it's really close, so we'll just push the material together until it holds itself in place. And oftentimes I'll use my parallel jaw pliers just to give it a little squeeze to make sure that it's not twisted and that it's level. So now I can just solder this. So I'll just hold the bezel in my third hand, joint up, mix up my flux, flux the join, and I flux top and bottom, and just a small piece of hard solder. This is only about 1.5 millimeters long. And I'll place it on the join using my flux brush. And we place it so that it touches both sides of the join. So we slowly dry the flux, keep the heat on the join, not down on the bottom part. You can see I'm on a bit of an angle. Once the flux is dry, heat the metal. And we'll quench it and pickle it. Then we push the bezel around the stone to make sure that it's the correct fit. And when I'm doing my bezel, I always put the join on a slightly rounded part of the stone because that way it's easier to sand it back. Now, before we put this on our sheet, what we need to do is make sure that it's nice and flat. So we can just put it on the bench and check it, and I can see that it isn't. And with fine silver, it's soft enough that you can probably just push it with your fingers. You can also gently tap it with your jeweler's hammer. Don't kill it. It is nice and soft, but you still have to be careful that you don't bend it out of shape. So back around your stone, make sure that it still fits. Lovely. Make sure it's still flat, and then we can solder it onto our base. Now, if you have a large piece of metal, don't try to solder your bezel on to the large piece and then cut it off, trying to save as much metal as possible. Because what will happen is you'll end up having to heat the whole piece up to a certain point before this gets hot enough. So cut it so that you're only heating the amount of metal necessary. So once our bezel is flat, we'll solder it onto the base. Now normally, I don't clean up the join until after I've soldered it onto the base and trimmed everything back. But because I'm going to put a decorative strip around it, I want to clean up the solder first because it'll be really difficult to get to with this in the way. So at this point we'll solder this. So we'll just flux around the inside of the bezel. And I just use my solder cutters and cut the solder so that it just drops right inside the bezel. And then I push it around with my flux brush. So that it's up against the side of the bezel. And now we'll just slowly warm this up until the flux dries out. and it'll turn a nice crusty white when it's dry, at which point, if the solder is moved away from the bezel, use your solder pick to push it back in place. Encircle the inside. You don't want your bezel to be hotter than the base, otherwise the solder will just jump up on the bezel. So you want to make sure that it flows at the base. So just circle. It'll come up to temperature, your flux will go clear, the solder will flow, and you can see it flow all the way around the outside. That means that you have a good solder joint all the way through. So now we'll quench this and pickle it. Quench it in water. And I don't really have to pickle it because I could see the solder run all the way around the outside as I was heating it. But we'll pickle it just to clean it up anyway. So my solder joint looks great. Now I'm going to use a little bit of half beaded wire. It's beaded on one side and flat on the other to fancy this up a little bit. And I'm going to use a combination of this and decorative shot. And this is just made by hammering balls of silver into a decorative shot plate, they call it. So it's flat on the back where you hammer it in. And what I'm going to do is put that like that. And then take a section of the shot wire, or the half round wire, and put it next to it. And then, so I'm going to put a couple of those here and a couple down here. And this bends very easily, so what I'll do is I'll just hold the end with my tweezers and just pull this around. And then I'll cut it here at the correct length, and I'll just use my saw, my jeweler's saw. And we want to make sure it's nice and flat to make it easy to solder. And make sure the curve is correct so it sits up tight against the bezel. Then I'll put another couple of pieces of shot and then bring the wire on around. So this has nothing to do with anything other than decoration. And this is quite easily bent, but by using my parallel jaw pliers, I can hold it nice and flat while I'm bending it. So just take your time. It's easy enough to work. And you can see it's quite easy to hold one end with your tweezers and then bend it around. So once we have our beaded wire and our shot in place, it's just a matter of fluxing it and placing our solder, and we place the solder around the outside. So we mix up our flux. And be careful because it's quite easy to push all this out of position. And now I'm going to take a whole bunch of 3 millimeter long pieces of hard solder and place it with my flux brush so that it's sitting on the base and right up against the beaded wire. Be fairly generous with it, because if you don't use enough, you'll have to go back and do it again later. So take your time. Now we'll dry out the flux first, like we always do. And the slower you heat this up, the better, because everything will stay in place better. But if the solder jumps around, it's okay. You can push it back in place with your solder pick. And you want to push your decorative shot and your half-round wire back into place too. Just make sure it's all lined up, because if it isn't, it's a real pain in the bum. To try to fix it later. So just circle with your flame. Try to bring everything up to temperature at the same time. Keep your eye on it. And once the solder starts to melt anywhere, then you can just focus your flame and work your way around. And I can see that it's all pretty much soldered. So now we'll quench it in water and pickle it. So after everything is all soldered and lovely, put a little bit of wax on your blade. I'm using a 3/0 blade. And we go all the way around the piece and cut around each little bump. So after I've gone all the way around and done all my sewing, then I go back around with an abrasive wheel, and this is 400 grade abrasive in a rubberized wheel. And that's just to smooth out the saw marks. So go all the way around, take your time, get all of the saw marks out. And when you're finished, it'll just look like you've gone over it with 400 grade sandpaper. So at this point, we'll make our ring shank to fit on the bottom, and I'm going to make it into a U shape, which I quite like because it tends to hold the ring more vertical. So this is annealed 1.5 by 3 half round wire. And we don't have to calculate the exact length of this because it's a U shape. And if you have a ring stick with the letters or the numbers on it, you can just bend it around it. So I'm going for an O, so I'll go a couple of sizes smaller. Just hold my thumb on it, bend it into a U, shift it down to the proper size, check that the ring fits nice and tight against the mandrel, and you can just use a texter to sight across and just mark it even with the ring stick or the ring mandrel if you wish. So then we'll just hold that in a ring clamp with the marks slightly above the end, and I use the flat part. And we just saw it, and we saw it slightly above. And just shift across. And then we can just take our Swiss No. 2 cut flat hand file file those perfectly flat. And if you did it correctly, it'll hold itself up when you position it. There, you can see a little bit better. So it holds itself up, and it's straight up and down. So now we're ready to solder that onto the setting. So I'll just put it on my charcoal block, hold my third hand on top just to make sure this doesn't fall over, and we'll flux it and solder it. So make sure your shank is straight up and down. If you're unsure, you can just use a steel rule, because that's 90 degrees, and you can place that on the base and just look. So take your time, make sure everything's where it should be. And I just flex the whole base, and that way it keeps the fire scale off it. And I'm using hard solder once again. Hard solder for everything on this one. And we just place the solder where the shank touches the base. Nestle the solder right up against the ring shank itself. Dry the flux out. And the solder will jump around a bit until the flux is dry. Then once the flux is dry, push the solder back where it goes, where it should go. And just circle the base and the shank. And there we are. Quench it in water and pickle it. All right, we're out of the pickle. Everything looks lovely, ready to polish. The top of the bezel is a little bit of a step, so we'll just sand that back. And when everything is all level and you see a dull finish on the top all the way around, we'll polish it. And this one I'm just going to put in the tumbler, in the rotating tumbler, for half an hour. So the top is nice and flat now, and I'm going to take my Swiss No. 2 cut flat hand file, and at about a 45-degree angle, I'm going to just thin the top of the bezel a little. We don't want a knife edge, but we want it a little bit thinner. And I'm actually holding my thumb so that the file doesn't go down and touch the decoration. And after you've gone all the way around, then it's in the tumbler. All right, we're out of the tumbler. We'll dry it off. And we're ready to set the turquoise in. So I'm using a GRS jeweler's bench vise because it doesn't have teeth, it's just nice and smooth. So that'll hold the ring without damaging it, without marking it. Now, when we go to put the turquoise in, if it doesn't quite fit, turquoise is quite soft. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to force it. And it'd be quite easy to just sand the edge back a bit. And as long as you stay down on this lower portion, you're not going to mark the part that's going to be above the bezel. A little on this end. So just work it a little bit at a time until it fits. Like that. Now you can use a bezel rocker if you wish, or you can use a punch. So just go around a couple of times, and the bezel rocker is nice in the fact that it doesn't mark the bezel. But the hammer setting punch is even nicer because it's easier to control. So a couple of times around, and then the last time around, you're at a fairly steep angle, and that's just to make sure that the edge is down against the stone. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to slip. So there's our ring, and there's our Chenier tubing, and it's not glued in or anything, it's just sitting in there at the moment. So you can see it's loose. Now I'm going to just leave this the way it is and hand it to Peter Keep, and have him set a stone in this and then glue the Chenier in place. But for now, it's almost finished with the exception of the faceted stone. and depending on the setting, he may flare the end of the metal. If he does, what you can do is just take a burr and turn it, a round burr, turn it slowly, and you can countersink this so that the stone is flush with the top. And then you just glue it.
So this is the ring finished with the faceted stone set in place. If you want to check this lesson out, it's free. So just go to jewelrytrainingsolutions.com.au and have a look under free lessons, or use the search bar and put Chenier in turquoise setting or something like that, and you should be able to find it.